everybody. I'm Carolyn Hadlock, and this is the Eunoia podcast. Eunoia is the Greek word for beautiful thinking, and that's what the show is all about. I interview beautiful thinkers who are creatives, founders, authors, and CEOs, and I try to get inside their heads. Today I'm talking with Joshua Ramus, who is the founder of Rex, an internationally acclaimed architecture and design firm based in New York City. Welcome to the podcast, Joshua. It's nice to have you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
I would love to start with your name. I understand it has a deeper conceptual meaning, but would you mind just explaining the reappraisal piece?
Sure. The name is a pun and has other layered meanings. I mean, in architecture, there's a history of architectural practices that have three-letter names: SOM, KPF, HOK, and so forth. So we worked in our identity with a firm called 2x4, with whom we've worked on many projects, and they had a beautiful position that a name should be like Wonder Bread, that it takes whatever meaning, whatever taste you put on it. So people can ascribe meaning to it. And so, Rex, in a moment, I'll explain how we got to Rex, but people also read many other meanings into it.
Yeah.
From, kind of Oedipal meaning to Tyrannosaurus Rex to the three-letter architectural firm. But the original root was the reappraisal of architecture, REX. So redo, rethink, reopen, re-question, re-challenge, reconsider. And, so all of those layered on top of each other is how we ultimately settled on the name. Also, having an X in a name is strong.
Yeah.
At some point, it became kind of a fait accompli.
Got it. Maybe the place to start, which drew me to you, was your approach seems from the name, from reappraisal of your craft and your practice and to the industry, but also to how you staff it and what your makeup is of your staff. And I know you talk about it as a think tank, and I'd love to hear you talk about the diversity of disciplines and how that all works together.
Mm-hmm. So historically, we've not only hired architects, but we've hired non-architects. We've had people with PhDs in chemistry and master's degree in economics. And it's not that we shun architects in any way. It's just that as a staff, we're looking for people who can think and argue and articulate their thoughts. Sort of all comers welcome if they're interested in architecture and its ability to truly impact human activity. So I think it's probably an important segue or description, is that my background prior to architecture, my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and I was very, if you were to get to know me, you'd understand that I argue all the time. For better or worse, I argue all the time.
Okay.
And I believe in argument, not in the sense of arguing, but like argument in making a narrative, to debate something, to get to the core of it. And I guess fundamentally, we believe that if we can't argue a position, an architectural solution, then it's not there yet. And so for us, creating an argument through words, through diagrams, through images, that's part of the design process. It's equal to the aesthetic image, that the thing that we're producing.
And so when you have a project, do you sort of bring the same group of people to every single project, or do you sort of assess what you think you need to sort of get to that space where the argument's solid?
Every project is different. And in an ideal scenario, we have projects in which we convince clients to think with us for sometimes as long as 3 months prior to doing architecture. And usually what happens during that time is that we will create architectural concepts as like test ideas, and sometimes they stick. If you give us the space and time to think with the client, inevitably by the end of that thinking phase, you will collectively have an understanding of the project that's very different from what the client thought it was at the beginning.
And they move on that journey with you.
Yes. And I actually think that's the responsibility of an architect. An architect's responsibility is to act as a kind of mirror or foil to a client. Mm-hmm. And two things I can say definitively about doing that. The first is it makes the design process much more efficient. So if there's a fear that taking 3 months to think is time you don't have, I know for a fact it shortens overall duration. And second, it avoids what I see happen time and again on clients' projects, is that if you don't go through that process, the client goes on a journey with you, and their level of understanding grows over that process. And so we describe that as the trail of tears. What eventually happens is that at some point, the client will suddenly say, oh, now I understand what you're talking about. And no, that's not what we want. And that's a year in.
Yeah.
I've just seen that on too many colleagues' projects where, because they don't suspend design, or everybody wants the architect to get started. And if they don't start making images, we need an image for fundraising, and we need to build excitement about the project. And so everyone rushes to design before anyone fully knows what it is they're designing.
Yeah, but that's a reality. I mean, how do you accommodate that? Because those are real things.
Well, there are plenty of exciting and remarkable things you can present to the public after a 3-month thinking phase.
And you also talk about we're having, what does the architectural moment look like right now? And then how are you either countering it or following it?
Yeah, going back to first principles. I mean, architecture is full of conventions, and many of them are conventions that were created for good reason and should still exist. Many of them are conventions that were created for good reason, but no longer should exist. And many of them weren't created for good reason. And so we tried to go back to first principles and look at those things again. And I think that architecture has largely become commodified.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's dangerous in that I think people believe that there are, in order for a commodity to be a commodity, it must rely on extensive convention. And I just don't think that, architecture is so site and problem specific that it's very difficult to have commodity in terms of design.
Oh,
so,
that's interesting. Yeah.
By example, there are all kinds of reasons why what everyone thinks is a conventional structure should work. But in a certain environment, be it environment that, it has earthquakes or wind or whatever, I mean, there's a whole host of things that might drive it. It actually doesn't make sense at all. I mean, a good example is the Seattle Central Library. Seattle is a high earthquake zone. And we had a big volume building in which we discovered that if we were to externalize the lateral system and divorce it from the gravity system, we actually got incredible economies. If I had just said that in the beginning of the project, everyone would have looked at me and said I was crazy. That's unconventional, and there's no way that could be true. We had to slowly tease that out over time to get to build people to that point to realize the economies of scale of it. My sense is that there's a lot of architecture that's created without a lot of thought, and people are buying into the belief of conventions that actually aren't necessarily appropriate to their project.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably true. And I like how you talk about trying to bring a sense of agency back to architecture. It does seem that architecture is seen as decorative a lot.
Yes. Whenever I discuss this with someone, I'm always worried that we're going to fall into the kind of trope of form versus function. And I don't want to do that, because I actually think that we in the office, we talk about performance, and aesthetics are performative. So aesthetics can be utilitarian. By example, the St. Louis Arch.
Yep.
Its only purpose is to be beautiful. That's it. It's meant to be a signifier. So clearly, aesthetics are utilitarian. You have to calibrate sort of classic functionality and classic aesthetics differently on every project. I often say that, I say it as a joke, but I also mean it, is that everyone has predilections, aesthetic predilections. Our work tends to be boxy. I have intellectual reasons why we do that. I also think it's probably, if you were to see my house, it's also kind of me, right? So
yeah.
I'm not sure which came first, the intellectual justification or a predilection.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I say jokingly, but it's actually kind of true, is I leave the discussion of beauty between me and my therapist. I never tried to discuss a project with a client based on beauty. Always try and discuss it based on that issue position, and does the object that we've created satisfy the positions we've taken? And do that because if you discuss something on beauty, it's a subjective discussion. So I might put something before people and say, I think it's beautiful. And they go, I don't. And the conversation's over. What do you say at that point? If we do our jobs right, we will find a solution that both meets all of those specific criteria and project hurdles that I happen to also think is beautiful. Like that's my job, is to be working in the background, trying to edit all the variants to find the one that is aesthetically compelling and which completely solves all of the project constraints.
Yeah. Do you think we're sort of in a moment of flamboyance with architectural style?
Not sort of. I think we're at the far end of the pendulum swing.
So where do you think that's coming from then?
Historically, I assume it has to do with the fact that, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, particularly in the United States, and at that time, the United States was really dominant. Two things were happening. There was like an increased litigiousness and complexity of the building and construction industry. And there was also, major recessions. Architects just got clobbered generation after generation. And so there became this moment where the practicalities of execution were beneath the profession.
Interesting.
And so you created this whole like intellectual movement, which was about purity and the purity of the idea, almost like paper architecture. And we can't be bothered with the vulgarity of execution. And that created a really horrible schism in the profession, which we're still suffering today completely. Today in the United States, there are design architects and executive architects. That's crazy. It's crazy that the person who is designing isn't expected to know how to execute. And it's crazy that the person who is executing shouldn't be exceptional at designing. And yet we've created that dichotomy. And the former, the designers, were then left in a kind of a world without constraint. And there kind of became a very personal, very, your art, your vision. The lack of need to execute led to a flamboyance that is problematic.
Yeah.
And it's problematic. Look, not aesthetically. I happen to not like it, and I happen to not like being in it. I've done studios with my students where I've let them design whatever they want to, and then I make them build it and sit in it. And they're like, "Oh, yeah, okay, I get it." These very fluid objects, while they're compelling, I don't think we can make them at the level that one would need to make them for them to be put into the world yet.
I'm just curious, what are the criteria for the projects you take on? Because you've done residential and massive commercial, international, domestic.
Good clients.
What makes a good client?
Someone that will take educated risks.
And so commercial, size, utility doesn't really matter that much to you?
No. We're always looking for projects that have some challenge or some, going back to the idea of agency, at the core of the practice, we want architecture that can do things. We're not that interested in architecture that is only representative. And so it comes down to, are there projects where there's something at stake? Mm-hmm. Can we invent something with the owner? Can we solve something with the owner? Can we change how people do something? It can be how you create art. It can be how you solve an economic problem.
Yeah, it seems like you're energized by constraints.
Yeah. But if people are paying attention, isn't everyone?
Well, I don't know. I mean, back to your point of, I think there's an efficiency and a profitability layer that gets put on a lot of things. And so, yeah, I'm not sure everybody is.
Isn't every step of education about resistance, right? Doesn't someone have to say no for you to actually think? Isn't resistance inherent in getting stronger in everything? It's inherent in athletics. It's inherent in intellectual growth. It's inherent. Like, if you just get to do what you want, it's going to be very quick, and the solution is going to be your first guess. Why is that interesting?
Yeah, yeah. And it doesn't have the staying power. I was looking at the D and Charles Weiling Theater in Dallas, and it's funny. I saw that a while ago, and when I was doing some research for this interview, I was like, "Oh, of course that's Joshua. Of course that makes sense now." But I thought it was interesting. One of the things you said on the brief, and I might not say it exactly right, but the idea that you were trying to preserve freedom of movement for them to do the things they already were doing. And I thought that was so interesting.
Mm-hmm. Something that I think has occurred in every project, or occurs in every project we do now. In looking backwards, I think we now realize it's true in just about everything we've done, is that we think that the idea of flexibility, at least in architecture, is wildly outdated. There is a notion of flexibility as being a kind of tabula rasa in which I can do anything I want.
Yeah.
So, the most obvious examples, in theaters, those are black box spaces, and in galleries, those are white cubes.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that both of those spaces are wildly restrictive. And they're restrictive because they don't add the kind of z-axis, or z-axes, money and time.
Hmm.
And interestingly enough, those typologies were created 70 years ago when labor and materials were not what they are today. The cost of labor was wildly lower than it is today.
Yeah.
And so now those things are incredibly restrictive because no one has the money or the time, the resources to conceive or to build those things. And so on almost every one of our projects now, we're seeing that to preserve certain freedoms that people have come to expect, you actually have to give them presets, things that are very specifically defined. Now, you give them 2, 3, or 4, or 5 along a spectrum such that they can move between those presets and they can do them without a lot of cost or time.
Yeah.
But they're very, very specific, highly defined. So just to give an example, I'm thinking about this because it comes from the Wiley. We didn't give them a black box. We gave them a theater that could, at a push of a button, transform between a true proscenium, a true thrust, a studio theater, sort of effectively a black box, or theater in the round. And the time and money to do that is quantifiable. So many stagehands, so many hours. And this is exactly how you do it. And it was the breakthrough project for us on this. That these ideas we didn't realize, but they actually were baked into the Seattle Library as well. But we didn't look at it in the same way at that time.
Yeah.
What was shocking about the Wiley Theater is that by giving them those tools, those preset tools, it weirdly opened up their flexibility.
Yeah.
We gave them those presets. And if you look at the first 23 performances, they did them in 18 different configurations.
That's amazing.
But we only gave you 4. So what happened? Because we only gave you 4. But what happened is that because they know how to move between those presets, they then almost immediately start to stretch them.
Interesting.
And bastardize them and tweak them. And it's far more flexible than a kind of hard modernist blank space. And we've been doing that now in museums, and we're doing it in performing arts centers, and we're doing it in libraries, and we're doing it in houses, and we're doing even office buildings. That you provide 3 or 4 different kinds of officing in a building, not one.
I love that.
I actually think it's the same idea, but it sounds like a bit of a segue. But it's also how we think about sustainability, that we're trying to design into our buildings their own future adaptive reuse.
I love that when you talk about that adaptive reuse and sort of broadening that definition of sustainability. And I wanted to ask you, beyond, just the sustainability piece of it, do you think there's a spirituality also to places and buildings that have been standing that you don't want to tear down? Or is it mostly through the lens of reworking with something that's already there.
Yeah. So, the other component of how we perceive sustainability is that density and diversity is actually the core of sustainability. If you just look at it from a conservation of energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, a building that's already been there for 100 years and it's already on the train lines and it's already next to schools and it's already next to a hospital, et cetera, even if it's inefficient from an energy standpoint, is still wildly more energy efficient than a new building that's efficient. I have to be honest, we don't talk about it much because I think people will look at us cross-eyed. But to come back to your question about spirituality, like I live in New York, and a whole host of reasons I love New York, and part of it is the embedded history in the place.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that there are all kinds of latent vectors going on in the city that I don't even understand anymore because they've been happening for 200 years.
Yeah.
And so when the Farley building, by example, which was the extension to the post office, gets converted into a new shopping mall, not only do I think, if the new shopping mall is good, but I also think they're taking advantage of all kinds of existing energy that no one can actually quantify.
Mm-hmm.
There are many decades and decades of how people did things because that building was there.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's all baked into, like when I say energy, I'm not talking about anything religious. I just literally mean people moved down 10th Avenue for a reason. And that building was part of that reason. And there's all kinds of things that we cannot even begin to identify about why the building has evolved and grown the way it has because it's been baked into so many systems. So, if you throw a huge rock into the middle of a stream, eventually the way the moss grows around the other rocks and the way the fish swim and everything will eventually subsume that rock into the system. And we can no longer even understand the system without that rock.
Yeah, it's so fundamental. Yeah.
It's so fundamental. And you shouldn't talk about the building, how it's going to fit into the context. You should talk about the context once the building is in it.
I love that. That's great.
Right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Because it may disrupt things, but it may disrupt it for the better.
Yeah.
The building in the context may be better than the context without the building.
I did want to ask you about, obviously, COVID and your sense on, as much as we know today at this current moment in time, how things are going to change for architecture with gatherings and how that's going to affect the craft of what you do.
Mm-hmm. I have two answers to that. The first way to say it is it's a bit of a vulgar anecdote, but we've worked for years with the firm that from Legacy was the structural engineer for the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
And the current leader of that firm, now emeritus, but spoke before Congress. And he was asked the question, well, how do we future-proof buildings such that they can withstand airplanes flying into them? And he looked at them and shook his head, and he said exactly the right thing. He said, the problem is not trying to figure out how to make buildings withstand airplanes flying into them. The only problem should be, how do we change the political environment where people don't want to fly airplanes into buildings?
Yeah, no kidding.
Like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
We're gonna change everything we make so that we can continue to antagonize each other and kill each other. Like, that's the solution.
Yeah.
So, having given that anecdote, I would say, gosh, I hope we're not thinking about a world in which we're going to make it okay to have pandemics.
Yeah.
Because I don't really want to go to theater where there's no energy in the room because everyone's 6 feet apart. And I don't want to have weddings that are 6 feet apart. And I don't want to have dances that are 6 feet apart. So I would say, how about we focus on the behavior that we should all know we should be doing right now so that we can squash this pandemic. We should be focusing on good science that would lead us to vaccines. We should be thinking about not plowing into every old growth forest and releasing it's all part of sustainability. Stop expanding exponentially, horizontally into ecosystems that have viruses that human beings were never in contact with.
Yeah.
That's the big picture. And then I hate to go a step further. as a species, we need to stop growing. Like I said, the core of sustainability is density and diversity. The real core is population control. Mm-hmm. And if we don't want to talk about population control, no one's serious about saving the planet. So then to bring it back, I think in the short term, those ideas of flexibility that I spoke about, the theaters that we have built and are building, as an example, they have that inherent flexibility that in the short term, you can do credible theater with people staying 6 feet apart because the infrastructure is there these are tools that are conceived to allow artistic directors incredible freedom in conceiving new art forms.
Yeah, I mean, who knew when you did the Wiley, and you might have done this in other theaters as well, just by being able to open up all the walls on the first floor to bring an elephant in for an opera could turn into letting them have outdoors and bringing the outdoors in for theater.
An artistic director did a really innovative play in which he wanted to actually have a football stand. He created a kind of a radical seating configuration. So the building was designed to support that. So right now, we're in a situation in which, unfortunately, one of the constraints is that artistic directors have to conceive of audience configurations that have people sitting socially distanced. Mm-hmm. And the building can support that. All I'm saying is I hope that we don't start asking architects to do that so that we don't have to consider population control, deforestation, good science, wearing a mask.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd rather do those things so that we can get back to just doing what we used to do.
Okay, 2 more questions for you. I'd love to hear about, how old is your daughter?
15.
How does she influence you creatively?
I have a slightly unusual situation in that starting at the age of 7, I've been the primary caregiver of my daughter and a single parent. So that now is 8 years ago, 9 years, in fact, that started to happen when she was 2. So that started 13 years ago. And that was really at the moment my career was taking off. And
wow,
I made a commitment to her that I would be present. And that forced a kind of efficiency in working that has been embedded in the office that I think is actually really healthy. I mean, in architecture, there's certainly there's the mythology that, if you're not working all the time and collapsing of sleep deprivation and your lungs collapsing, you haven't given for your art. Mm-hmm. I think it's bullshit.
Yeah.
Our expectation is you shouldn't be here on the weekends. And at 7:00, we turn the lights out. And there was a period when she was small in which, I would drop her off at school at 7:45, and I had to pick her up after school between 4:45 and 5:00. And so at 4:45, I was running out the door.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter what day it was, and it didn't matter what emergency was happening. And people would say, I just have one more question. I was like, my child is going to be pushed out onto the street in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So no, it's not happening.
Gotta go.
And she'll be in bed, bathed, and sleep in 3.5 hours. You can call me then. And I can't say it was an overwhelmingly enjoyable life for a while because then I was working from 8:30 until 2 a.m. and then getting back up and getting her to school. And that's all I could do. But it created a rigor in the office and kind of an accountability in the office that I think is really healthy. There's no question that this team works really, really hard. And there are periods where they do work all weekend and they do work all night. It's just that it's not the expectation. I don't want to know how long someone is working. I don't want to, if they go home early, I assume it's because they've gotten done what they need to get done and they've got something they need to do or they'll pick it up tomorrow or whatever. It just creates an environment in the studio of respect and trust. And people don't violate it and they're exceptional.
Yeah.
And so it may seem like a far way to come from suddenly being a 38-year-old single father with a 2-year-old, but it did grow into all those things.
I'm sure that was hard. You had 3 shifts, but it's...
3 shifts.
Yeah.
Well, me and just about every single mother on the planet.
I know.
I will say that this is a total non-architectural thing or discussion, but men certainly get the benefit of that, in that I was always treated as exceptional for just doing what women have been doing forever. And that came with certain benefits of, like, I could go to a client meeting with my child and a baby Bjorn, and people would be, oh, how amazing. Whereas a woman architect, I don't think could do that.
Yeah, no, she'd be seen as not understanding priorities.
Right.
Yeah.
And boundaries.
Yeah. Okay, last question, and this has just been so delightful. I really appreciate it. How would you define beautiful thinking? That is the essence of the blog. So I always ask the question.
I just got quiet because my knee-jerk reaction almost sounds antithetical to everything I said. And I'm trying to think, is it or not? And what I was started to say was thinking without constraint. I guess I don't mean it the same way as I would saying architecture with constraints. Meaning, I think thinking without constraint means finding new one-off innovative solutions to constraint. If that makes sense. It's like there are different constraints. Right? Thinking without constraint isn't the same thing as ignoring the constraints of an architectural project. It's being unburdened by convention and a priori ideas and history and so forth.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care. Have a great day. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. And I hope you took something from it. Something that'll help you with your next meeting, next pitch, your next big project. But above all, I hope it inspires you to think strange, different, new, and beautiful thoughts. For more from this interview and other chats with beautiful thinkers, visit carolinehadlock.com to subscribe on Medium and follow @Unoia Quarterly on Instagram. That's EUNOIA Quarterly.